thought this was okay. What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you a card discussion on Super Polymerization, and oh boy, yeah, Super Polymerization is now at 3, courtesy of the July 2019 Forbidden and Limited list. Now, when this card was at 2, it was already seeing a fair bit of play, but now that it's at 3, it actually changes a lot because now you're going to see this card a lot more consistently, and people can rely on that more so and actually incorporate this more into their deck building, and it's going to shape the format in a very significant way, and that's why I want to bring you guys a discussion on it, because you're already seeing it have tons of impact on the format as is. You're definitely going to see it have impact at any upcoming events, especially events like the Pro Play Tour event taking place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on August 17th and 18th. There is a $20 entry fee for a $2,000 prize pool, and I'll be there doing live stream commentary for the event. So links are down in the description if you want to attend. But moving back on to Super Polymerization. Most of you guys know what this card does, but for any newer players or returning players to the game, Super Polymerization is a quick play spell with an effect that reads as follows. Discard 1 card. Fusion summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from either field as fusion materials. Neither player can activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation. And that last bit of text is why Super Polymerization is the scary card that it is. It is essentially a spell speed 4, which I know is an unofficial term, but the fact that there is a card that exists in the game that you cannot respond to is not exactly fun or interactive. As soon as someone plays this card, anyone just wants to throw their hands up in the air because you cannot do anything about it, regardless of how your field is. Now, some of you might argue, well, if you're going up against a certain combo deck that has this break my board type strategy, Super Poly is a nice way to counter that. And while I will agree with you for this particular instance, especially because the format is looking to be a format shaping up in that way, that doesn't necessarily facilitate or excuse that Super Poly should exist. It's very bad card design, and that doesn't necessarily excuse the combo decks from being as powerful as they are, but I don't think just because they exist, we need a card this powerful to put them in check. Honestly, we shouldn't have either, but that's definitely a discussion for another video. So what I want to go ahead and discuss with Super Poly is some of the instances where you're going to be wanting to use this card. And Super Polymerization is only good as the fusion monsters it can summon, and there's 3 in particular I want to discuss. The first and probably the most commonly used one that you're going to see coming up in this format is Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. Starving Venom Fusion Dragon only requires any 2 dark monsters to make except tokens, which in this particular format, at least from how it's shaping up, that is going to be incredibly easy to assemble. So Starving Venom Fusion Dragon has an effect that reads, if this card is fusion summoned, you can make this card gain attack equal to 1 opponent's special summon monster until the end of this turn. Once per turn, you can target 1 level 5 or higher monster your opponent controls. Until the end of this turn, this card's name becomes that monster's original name and replace this effect with that monster's original effects. If this fusion summon card is destroyed, you can destroy all your opponent's special summoned monsters. Now, the second card we're going to be discussing is Predaplant Dragostapelia. Now, this just requires 1 dark monster, but it also requires 1 fusion monster, so it's a little bit more specific. However, in the context of some of the best decks of the format, that isn't really too difficult to achieve. Predaplant Dragostapelia has an effect that reads, once per turn as a quick effect, you can target 1 face-up monster your opponent controls. Place 1 predator counter on it, and if it's a level 2 or higher, it becomes level 1 as long as it has a predator counter. Negate the activated effects of your opponent's monsters that have predator counters. And the third and final Super Poly target we're going to be discussing is Mudragon of the Swamp. Now, Mudragon of the Swamp has a very unique fusion summoning requirement. It needs any 2 monsters with the same attribute, but different type, which again, in the context of this metagame, isn't too difficult to pull off, and it's still fairly generic, at least as far as Super Poly targets are concerned. Now, this card has an effect that reads, your opponent cannot target this card or monsters on the field with the same attribute as this card with card effects. Once per turn as a quick effect, you can declare 1 attribute. This card becomes that attribute until the end of this turn. So now that we've covered the 3 best targets for Super Polymerization, let's discuss them in the context of the overall metagame. First up, let's talk about Danger Thunder Guard Dragon, or whatever variant you want to call it, because now sometimes they're playing Crusadia, not playing the Thunder, but essentially you know what I'm referring to. Now, Danger Thunder Guard Dragon is able to assemble these boards that have multiple negations and are very difficult for your opponent to play through. They typically end on a Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss, a Thunder Dragon Colossus, a Hieratic Seal of Heavenly Spheres, sometimes another negation, or maybe even a secondary Colossus. It really just depends on how good their hand really is. Oh, and they can sometimes rip one, if not two cards out of your hand, courtesy of cards like Chaos Dragon Levianeer, as well as Darkest Diabolos. Now, how do you use Super Poly in this instance? Well, in all these decks we're going to be talking about, Super Poly is definitely a go second option, because by allowing you to clear the board, then you're free to do your plays with the remaining 4 cards in your hand, because Super Poly does require a discard, and you will have 6 cards when you draw your 6th card for turn. So in the instance of this deck, you can use Super Poly to fuse away your opponent's Thunder Dragon Colossus and their Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss and summon your Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. Now, the thing is, as soon as Starving Venom hits the field, it's going to demand some sort of answer from your opponent, because with it on the field, the fact that it can threaten the board and just threaten a huge amount of damage. Remember, Starving Venom is a 2800 attack monster with the potential to get even stronger due to its ability, or the fact that it can also just nuke the board. Venom is going to force some sort of negation out of your opponent if they have anything. And remember, they still have the Hieratic Seal on the field, which means they could most likely probably just tribute that off to bounce the Venom back to your extra deck. But depending on what else they have on the board, even if they just have one Colossus left, or if they just have, you know, something like maybe say, oh, I don't know, like a Hope Harbinger or anything like that, you should be able to play through that with the remaining 4 cards in your hand, just to be able to push through and either set up a board of your own or just OTK your opponent in any given particular instance. Now, another deck that's been accumulating a significant amount of hype is Pendulum Magician. And when it comes to Pendulum Magician, there's a lot of different ways that Super Poly can help break the boards that Pendulum Magician assembles. So first up, let's again talk about Starving Venom Dragon. Now, even though the deck is primarily comprised of dark monsters, the end board actually doesn't have as many dark monsters as you may think. However, that doesn't mean it's impossible to summon a Starving Venom using your opponent's monsters. For instance, they could have something like Mythical Beast Jackal King. They could have something like Endymion, the Mighty Master of Magic. They could also have a Borreload Savage Dragon. These are 3 very common targets in the Pendulum Magician strategy that they will use on their end board, because each of these is a negation, or sometimes multiple negations in their own right. So by having any 2 of these 3 on the field, you can Super Poly them away for a Venom, and again, that's probably going to prompt one of their other negations if they have any left. Otherwise, you could just most likely nuke their board with that Venom that you summoned. But another thing you can do is with the Predaplant Fusion is take advantage of the fact that they have Odd Eyes Vortex Dragon. Odd Eyes Vortex Dragon is a fusion monster, and then that means they just need one other dark monster on the field, which in the case of, as we just described, could be Savage Dragon, Jackal King, or could be the Endymion, which means you can get rid of those negations, summon the Predaplant Fusion, and again, you can bait some sort of other negation because of the Predaplant's ability to be able to negate the activated effects of other cards. That is a quick effect too, so it's another neat little trick. And if that weren't enough, when you look in the context of a card like Mud Dragon, there's even ways you can summon this into the Pendulum player board as well, because take a look at cards like Hieratic Seal of Heavenly Spheres, as well as F.A. Dawn Dragster. These are both light monsters that are different types, which means you can use this to get rid of 2 negations instantaneously, summon the Mud Dragon, and now you have the ability to protect your own board because of Mud Dragon's ability to target itself, change the attribute, and then anything you have that is the same attribute, if you're playing a mono attribute deck that is, that means you're going to have that full targeting protection. So it seems that when it comes to Super Poly, there's so many interesting and niche ways that you can actually just remove several negations from your opponent's board. Your opponent can't respond to it due to Super Poly being the absurdly broken card that it is, and then that can help you progress your own game state with the remaining 4 cards in your hand and help swing the game back in your favor. Let's even look at a deck like Orcus, which is by no means dead, even though it did lose Rusty Bardiche on the July 2019 Forbidden and Limited list. Thing is, the deck's comprised entirely of dark monsters, which means you're pretty much always going to have targets for a Starving Venom Fusion Dragon. You have the fact that the deck does play fusions in the form of El Shadal Winda, plus cards like Thousand Eyes, which are a little bit more specific and probably a lot more niche in the times you can actually use Super Poly and resolve it in that way, but it is an opening, and not to mention, because they do play tons of dark machines, they still play tons of dark support as well, well, which actually gives Mud Dragon the ability to see some play as well, in tandem with stuff like Armageddon Knight, Dark Grepher, or any of the danger cards. So you just have all these ways to break through the boards of these very solid combo decks, and then that way you can help turn the tables on your opponent, start taking control of the game, and hopefully win on the back of Super Poly. So I've been discussing a lot in this video using Super Polymerization as an offensive tool going second, because that's primarily where the strength of this card lies, but what about as a defensive tool for going first? Because there are going to be times where you do draw this in your opening hand, and it's not like a starter or an extender, and it doesn't progress your game state in any way. So how can we best take advantage of Super Poly as a trap card, so to speak, to disrupt our opponent? Well, let's take a look in context of all the decks we've discussed in this video. Danger, Thunder Dragon, Guard Dragon. Well, you've got stuff like the Dangers, which Nessie is like a sea serpent, Jackalope is a beast, I believe. I think Tsuchinoko is like a reptile. All the Guard Dragons are dragons, so the fact you have so many different types gives some validity to Mud Dragon just to summon something like that. But they're also all dark, so you can summon a Starving Venom Fusion Dragon at any point, and as soon as they start to go into their Guard Dragon combo or anything like that, you could probably just punish the combo entirely, or if you just see there's two monsters with the same attribute but different type, or if they just have two darks, you can just punish their board, and they may not be able to recover from that. They can't respond to it because Super Poly is absolutely busted, and the thing is, that just goes to show how good of a card Super Poly can be, even if you are going first. Look at Pendulum Magician. That's another example, because the Pendulum Magician cards themselves are all darks, and while they may all be spellcasters, that does take Mud Dragon out of the equation. You can still just summon a Starving Venom and be just fine, and it just dodges and gets rid of those cards entirely, making it much more difficult for your opponent to recover, since you can drop this on them at any point and they cannot respond to it. The fact that it is a spell speed 4, quote unquote, is so powerful. And again, Orcus is the exact same way, because the deck is primarily dark focus. It's very easy to just drop something on them at any point, and again, there's really nothing they can do. Babel doesn't do anything, because again, the fact they can't respond to it makes Super Poly such an absolute beast of a card. Now, I think the biggest argument here is going to be main decking versus side decking Super Polymerization, because now that the card is at 3, if you're trying to use this as a tool to break your opponent's board, if you're going second, that means you have about a 43 to 44% chance of seeing this card in your opening hand, but that's just in the opening 6 card hand. You have to think about the fact that the Dangers are essentially all upstart goblins, which also happen to play under a card like Thunder Dragon Colossus, which means you could dig deeper into your deck with a card like this and help find Super Poly even more consistently than beyond the scope of your 6 card hand. For these other rogue decks that are taking advantage of Super Poly that we've seen in the past, like stuff like Guru Control, they play stuff like Pot of Extravagance, and while you do risk banishing your Super Poly targets, you don't really need the extra deck anyway, so you can double up on those, but you get to go 2 cards deeper into your deck to find that Super Polymerization more consistently and help deal and break your opponent's boards. And since I mentioned the extra deck, one thing to consider is extra deck space, because if you're playing a strategy that doesn't necessarily rely on the extra deck, like let's say Guru Control, then you're going to be perfectly fine running a card like this. However, if you're running a combo deck that has very specific combo pieces that you need to play a lot of in your extra deck, you may not have room to be running these Super Polymerization targets. Then that begs the question, well, you could play them in the side deck, and while that's true, one thing you have to consider is the surprise factor here, because once your opponent knows that you're playing Super Poly, they can play around it and basically make a board that wouldn't be susceptible to losing outright to that card. And if your opponent sees that you're side decking in a card to your extra deck, especially knowing that Super Polymerization is at 3 in this format, that's going to ruin the surprise, and if your opponent knows you're going second, they're going to be less likely, if they're a good player, to play into Super Poly. You do still have to draw it, but it definitely is a card that everyone is going to have on their radar. I guess one of the big downsides of Super Polymerization is that if your opponent isn't playing one of the decks that we've mentioned in this video, if they aren't playing a deck comprised solely of dark monsters, or if they're not playing a mono attribute based deck where Mud Dragon could be a good Super Poly target, then Super Polymerization isn't going to do anything. And yes, while that is a very valid claim, in the context of the specific metagame, Super Polymerization has a lot of valid targets, so it's going to be live 5 more often than not, but it does depend on the context of your local metagame. So overall, Super Poly is an absolutely incredible card and definitely something you should be considering in your deck building process, whether it's something you want to incorporate or something you definitely need to play around, because if you don't play around it in your deck building process, you're definitely going to get blown out by it when you're playing on the battlefield. So guys, that's going to do it for this video. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Super Polymerization. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member, because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.